Hello, it's John Heaton, and today I'm going to review the superb double volume books of the McCartney Legacy. This is volume 1 and this is volume 2. So volume 1 was given to me for my 60th birthday back in May by Dave Costello, thanks Dave, and the second one I picked up at Christmas. And I haven't been a very good book reader in the last few years. In fact, I hardly got through a book at all, but pretty effortlessly devoured these two volumes. They're close on 700 pages each, so that's 1,400 pages nearly, about the length of War and Peace or Lord of the Rings, which you wouldn't catch me reading, but I devoured these pretty quickly in about maybe 10 days each, something like that. Incredible detail, very comprehensive, the best yet as far as I'm concerned in terms of McCartney biographies or partial biographies, because they only cover up to 1980 January on the volume 2 ends there, so quite a bit more to come. Very well written, very well researched. Every quote they give is referenced at the back of the book throughout the many chapters. Interesting, in the introduction they talk about if there are two quotes which are contradictory, maybe say Paul said something recently and then at the time he said something different, they've gone with the quotes at the time as being more reliable, and I think it's a sensible approach. And a good example of that is the song Let 'Em In, which in an April 76 interview he said was half written for Ringo before he decided to keep it for himself, but in the recent interview he said no, it was not written for Ringo, be careful what you read on the internet. So I thought that was quite interesting. But the thing about these two volumes is it covers the period 1970 to January 1980, and it was a decade where Paul cared probably more about his new work than he did about revisiting the Beatles' former glories, and I think that makes a very refreshing decade, and I've always enjoyed his music in the 70s more than any other decade since, and I will say that reticence to talk about the Beatles lasted at least up until 74, 75, when he gradually introduced Beatles songs into his set and was more willing to talk about them. But certainly the first few years of Wings, he was very against anything to do with talking about the Beatles. Now what we have in the book is not the author's opinion about what they think of the music, although they do offer their opinions indirectly through talking about maybe the chord structure of a song. For example, Warm and Beautiful is gone into quite a lot of detail about the beautiful chord structure of that song. But in general, they've gone with contemporary reviews. And one has to say, this is one of the shocking things, well, not so shocking for me, but maybe people coming to the period anew would be quite shocked as to how negative the reviews were of Paul's music in the 70s, and that's almost without exception. I think most albums were slated, with the exception of Band on the Run. I think all of the albums received negative criticism, not universal, but it gets quite repetitive reading these two books about, oh, here we go, another negative review, and it's interesting to compare those contemporary reviews when Paul was seen as maybe not living up to his Beatle image or not competing with the punks. Interesting to compare recent decades reviews, which tend to be glowing about any new effort he puts out, culminating in a very strange article in Private Eye a couple of weeks ago, where it's basically saying because Paul had the longevity and was still going, recording concerts, doing concerts successfully, and having a 2-volume legacy set written about him, then therefore he's the most talented Beatle or something to that effect, and dismissing John and George. I found that quite shocking anyway. This book is beautiful in terms of the detail surrounding whether it's the Ram sessions in New York City or the Lagos sessions for Band on the Run, or the New Orleans sessions for Venus and Mars, the Nashville sessions in 74, talking with numerous people who were actually there at the time, not only the members of Wings themselves through archive interviews mostly, because Denny did not want to contribute to this book, maybe because he had upset Paul with previous times he'd talk to the press. Anyway, Aubrey Powell from Hypnosis is some beautiful insights from him and memories. Howie Casey, the sax player. Michael Lindsay Hogg is interviewed. Various Wings members, as I said, Michael Parkinson, Peter Brown, that's to name but a few. And things I didn't know, because the beauty of a book like this is how much is new to you after a sort of a lifelong period of being 50 years of being a fan, basically, and how much you're going to learn through reading a book like this. Well, a hell of a lot is the answer. For example, the Venus and Mars Gatefold, beautiful story from Aubrey Powell about how they went to the desert, and they were all had a barbecue on this sort of deserted desert, and then drove back in the car, and Linda got stopped by the police, and they smelt the smell of marijuana, and then the cop recognised Paul and asked for an autograph, and they signed an autograph and got away with it, and giggling all the way back to Los Angeles by the sound of it. That was quite amusing. The Venus and Mars cover is interesting because Aubrey Powell's partner, Storm, in Hypnosis, didn't like the concept of two billiard balls, and so stormed out the room, pun not intended. And so Paul said, okay, well, I'm not working with him, but I'll work with you. So they went ahead. And I've always thought that the two balls on the front of Venus and Mars were snooker balls coming from England, but I guess because it was shot in the US, they are pool balls, which I thought was interesting. Not that it makes too much difference. Charles Shaar Murray, very interesting, tense interview with Paul at the time of Venus and Mars, and he was sitting in reception at MPL thinking, how do you tell an ex-Beatle he's made a lousy album? And he proceeds to confront Paul, saying, you know, the Round on the Run was rocking and this one's just light. And Paul sort of takes an objection and says, well, it's not all light, Call Me Back Again is not light. And then Charles Shaar Murray said, it sounds like David Essex. And you could tell he's getting quite upset and said, no, it doesn't. Anyway, Paul to this day remembers that interview. It must have had quite a mark on him. So I thought that was quite amusing. Didn't know Jimmy McCulloch had helped out on the drumming of Rock Show. That was an interesting bit of information. Children, Children, the song from London Town. The line, I know a tiny waterfall, a magic little place where we can play together and watch the fishes race. That was a reference to Paul's place in Sussex, which had a tiny waterfall. I didn't know that. That was interesting. George turns up to the studio to visit Paul in '79 and compliments the track Baby's Request, which was played over. So that was stuff I'd never heard before. David Bowie sat down and listened to all the tracks proposed for Back to the Egg, including the outtakes. And he famously thought the broadcast should have been a single, and he didn't like the song Cage. Interesting stuff. Good pictures throughout. Don't know where they found half the pictures. There's pictures of the Fair Carol boat in the Virgin Islands. And there's a picture of Paul actually recording I'm Carrying on the deck of the boat, which is beautiful. There's a very interesting letter from November '71, so almost a year after the Beatles' court action. One can only describe it as infantile, really. It's a letter from Paul to Alan Klein. Dear Pig, you have nothing to do with my affairs, so keep out of them. F off, Paul McCartney. This was to do with the controversy surrounding Wildlife release and whether it should have an Apple logo and the ABCO address on the back of the sleeve. And eventually they compromised with a tiny little apple on the back of the US issue, but not the UK. Interesting stuff about the Wildlife Party, where Paul wore this pretty horrendous suit, which wasn't even finished. Tommy Nutter had designed it, but it wasn't even finished. And I must say, Wings don't look particularly photogenic in their first photo outing, but interestingly, we get to see the guest list of that party, and we all knew, well, I knew Elton John was there, but I didn't know Jimmy Page was there, members of The Who, Malcolm McDowell, the actor who'd recently been in Clockwork Orange, Sir Joe Lockwood, chairman of EMI, Ginger Baker, to name but a few. Then what else? They had a playback of Wildlife for the press, and Paul spent most of his time bitching about the other Beatles and not talking about Wings, which was a bit unsettling for the other members of Wings. And then probably the most interesting thing about the whole 2-volume set is in October '69 up in Scotland for an interview with Life magazine. around about the time when there were rumours that he was dead, he actually said, "We make good music and we want to go on making good music, but the Beatle thing is over. It has been exploded, partly by what we have done and partly by other people. We are individuals." Now, this was not picked up on by the reporter, not picked up on by the editor of Life magazine, not splashed all over the headlines as the Beatles are splitting up, not picked up at all by the look of it, which is fascinating. And as we know, we had to wait till April 1970 to hear the public news of the split. There's an interesting bit on page 15 of volume 1 where John Kurlander, the engineer at Abbey Road, he says, "Individually, each of the Beatles was great to be with. They were funny, warm, friendly, really a delight. If there were 2 of them, that was also great. If there were 3, it could be a little dicey, but generally it was fine. But when all 4 were together, they closed ranks, and it would be horrible. It didn't matter how any of them had treated you on his own. When all 4 of them were in the room, everyone was treated as an outsider." I thought that was an interesting quote there from John Kurlander. So inevitably I did find a few errors in the book, but they're few and far between. I think that they rather carelessly trotted out the story that all 4 Beatles had met at Friar Park in March 1970 at the party for George and Patty, and I think even Chris O'Dell has admitted that her recollection was faulty on that, and that wasn't the case. And I think the consensus is they weren't all 4 of them there at that party. Michael Lindsay Hogg is quoted as saying he'd never worked with Paul. Sorry, the authors say he'd never worked with Paul since Get Back, Let It Be, when he did the videos for London Town and With a Little Luck, but he'd actually worked on the Helen Wheels video in '73. The London Town press launch, they say, launched from Charing Cross Pier, the exact spot from which the album cover shot was taken. Well, if you know London, if you're at Charing Cross Pier, you have to go through several bridges before you get to Tower Bridge, including Waterloo Bridge, Blackfriars Bridge, Southwark Bridge and London Bridge. So they would have had to travel a good 10 or 15 minutes in the boat before they got to the spot where they took the picture of with Tower Bridge behind them. Girls' School is quoted as getting to number 11, when in actual fact it only got to number 33. This is in the US, where it was promoted as the A-side. So if I have a slight regret, is that I don't think anyone will bother doing this superb kind of detailed volumes for George and John, let alone Ringo, which I think is a shame. But in conclusion, I'm very happy to have this legacy stuff for Paul, very quickly produced actually, the second volume out within 6 months of the first, or 6 or 7 months, and I guess they're going to continue, although it'll get sort of gradually less interesting as we go through the rest of the decades. But these first 2 volumes are gold dust as far as I'm concerned, and I'm very impressed. Congratulations to the authors, and thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.